Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Andrew Zwerling. I'm here with my partner, Salvatore Puccio, and it's our privilege and pleasure to give today's webinar, Conducting a Proper Employee Performance Review. By way of introduction, just to tell you briefly about our firm, about Sal, about myself. Garfunkel Wild is a full-service healthcare law firm with approximately 90 lawyers in New York, New Jersey, Connecticut, Florida, and Washington, D.C. that's been around for, at this point, more than 45 years. By full service, I mean healthcare, litigation, managed care, corporate, finance, mental health law, biotech, and pertinent to today's webinar that Sal and I are putting on, employment law. Sal and I have decades of experience as litigation attorneys, but also we perform, if not on a daily basis, certainly on a regular basis, employment counseling. We wear two hats, and for those of you who've heard this presentation before, as we've always said, when we handle litigation, we see how our clients have handled things correctly, those who were listening, those who were not, when we've given counseling advice, and then we take what went right or what went wrong in the litigation, and we use that to assist and inform our day-to-day employment counseling. With regard to the presentation, we've given many of these in person with a bunch of 100 people, online, through this remote format with, 500 or more people at a time. It never changes when Sal and I give these presentations. We like getting questions. We try, even though it's a little more distant using the remote mechanism, we like to make it a conversation. So use your chat feature to ask us questions as we go along. We'll do our best to answer them in real time. Don't worry about throwing us off. Again, we like to engage as we go along, and we want your questions answered at the end of the day. As for today's webinar and the topic of the day, there's no federal law requiring employers to conduct employee performance reviews, but for practical reasons, very sensible, practical reasons, most employers anyway, conduct these reviews at least annually. Performance reviews can benefit employers and employees, and we'll go in more detail about what some of those benefits are, by improving work performance, including by increasing efficiency and productivity. It can improve workplace fairness and objectivity. It can certainly enhance employee attitudes and employee engagement by helping employees feel engaged in their work and their place in the overall hierarchy of the organization. On the other hand, if you handle a performance review the wrong way or in a way that's less than desirable, it can increase your litigation risks and undermine all of the positive objectives that you can otherwise achieve if you do it correctly. And what Sal and I are going to try and accomplish today, we're going to give you practical advice, practical guidance for you as employers on how to conduct performance reviews. Explain how these reviews can benefit you, give you practical advice on maximizing the benefits that we're going to delineate and minimizing the risks of conducting performance reviews poorly. And we're going to include at the tail end certain common pitfalls to avoid, traps for the unwary, so to speak. So with that introduction in place, we're going to go right into the subject matter.
Okay, so as Andy was saying, we're coming at this, and the reason we're talking to you about performance reviews, sometimes it might seem like it's a basic thing that everybody does and you do it once a year. But as Andy was saying, what we're finding and talking to our clients from a perspective of what we talk about employee engagement, this is something that means a lot, not only to staff, but means a lot to the organization overall. And getting it right is really paramount to having an organization, whether you're in healthcare or other industries that we service, that's important in moving you forward. And from the benefits perspective, there's three buckets that I like to think about in terms of how is my performance review going to benefit everyone around. And the first is it's going to benefit your business overall. If you do it effectively, it's going to benefit patient care. It's going to benefit productivity. It's going to benefit efficiency. And all of those from an employer standpoint help with your bottom line. It helps towards making money, making the company profitable. And this is specific if you're in healthcare, we're talking about patient care, of course, being our ultimate goal, but also if you're in the business, if you're selling widgets or you're selling something else, or you're in the service industry, having these performance reviews work in your favor can increase output and efficiency. You're going to spend less time for management and administration teaching people how to do things if you can do it throughout the course of the year. The second bucket that we look to focus on is how is it going to benefit the employee? The employee is going to benefit when they get frequent updates or when they get specific information about how to do their job. You might not realize you have an employee who's an untapped resource that can do more than you're giving them. You might also have an employee who's struggling in a particular area. We've had many clients that come to us and say, so-and-so was hired to do our accounts receivable. She can't even run an Excel spreadsheet. And then you find out when you sit down with that person, they know how to run Excel, but they don't know how to run Excel with your program. So now if we teach them and work it together, it's less time management and administration has to do on the back end, fixing those errors and those mistakes. So that second bucket is the employees. And the third one, which Andy alluded to, is really a protection for the overall entity. And we're going to talk about in the context of litigation or of a pretext for a termination. But a good part of what Andy and I do is defending companies against employees who come forward and say, oh, no, you fired me because of my race, my gender, my sexual relationships. Well, that's why you're firing me. It has nothing to do with my performance. But if you have a good, objective performance review, you can push that aside. And what I mean is, I'll share just a couple of examples of why this is important and why we're spending, half hour, 45 minutes with you today talking about it. At least 10, 12 years ago, I had an employment case where employee was just doing poorly. And you would look at reports. She was writing reports, and they were written for grants, and they were written for other very important functions within the company. They were medical records that she had to help organize. And the writing was poor. The grammar was poor. The sentences were all over the place. So the company was going to sit down and say, look, it's just not working out. They're going to terminate this individual. They sat down, they had that meeting, and the individual said, well, I have cancer, I've been missing work, all of this, that, and the other thing. Brought a lawsuit. They had to settle because the timing was you got fired, told about cancer, had been out for a couple of days. And the problem was we defended it for a while. I said, give me the performance reviews. Give me the evaluations detailing all the improper responses, the problems that you had. When I got those performance reviews, you would have thought this was the best employee the company ever had. 10s across the board. That was it. They just checked 10, 10, 10, 10, 10. They never wrote any substance, never wrote any issues. It was never even presented to the employee. So when the other lawyer got that discovery, I disclosed it, it made their case, and we had to write a check. That's the bad side. The good side is I have another client just last year. Employee couldn't work Excel, couldn't work other issues, was having problems, was late, etc. We sent her out. She complains it's about a disability. It's because of her race. It's because of her gender. Basically, kitchen sink approach. Gets a lawyer, writes us a letter. You're discriminating. This is all a pretext. That's what they write. They use the word pretext. I said, okay, sure. I send him the spreadsheet that our client created. I mean, it was a spreadsheet of all of the things that were wrong on a daily basis, down to like the hour. The lawyer, it was so profound, the lawyer walked away from the case. He said, I'm not representing her anymore. I'm out on this. And that was it. We fired her and it went away. So there's bad and there's the good. And that's what we're talking about in terms of the benefits. So that's the overall. Some of the specifics, the benefits to the employer, and Andy touched on some of these, productivity, output, patient care. If you've got a nurse or a nurse practitioner that needs some bedside manner training or some help with that, talk to them about it in real time, and then they can improve and it can ultimately help the care that the people are receiving at your facility. Find out what's going on. You can have periodic check-ins. I try to do this in our practice around the office. I talk to people. How are you finding this? How is this going? Hey, you could do better with this. I think you could do this in a different way. Do it in real time so that the productivity goes longer and you have to spend less time correcting it. I don't think it's effective or appropriate if you wait the calendar year and do your reviews in December or January, and that's the only feedback a person gets. That should be your one big opportunity to lay everything out there. But I just was doing a witness interview with another client. they do quarterly check-ins. I think that's a great idea. You know, if you have the ability and the staffing and the resources, something to consider. Other benefits for the employer, you're going to get an assessment of your staff. You're going to see what they can and cannot do if you're doing it appropriately. You don't need to hold on to an employee who can't add. You don't need to hold on to an employee who can't draw blood. If you're doing these evaluations and it comes out objectively that the person just can't hang and do this job, well, you have to either move them to a different role or you have to separate. So don't waste time and get, dragged down by someone who's not doing the right thing. It also, on the flip side, can help you determine if someone's ready for a promotion. Does someone need a performance improvement plan? Does someone need to be spoken to for other reasons? So it gives you an insight into what's needed. And along all those lines, we have, like I said, if you're going to move on from someone or someone is doing good or we're going to shift them, gives you some insight into what recruiting tasks you need. There's staffing shortages throughout healthcare. We know that. And it also, overall, if it's done properly, it's going to boost morale. This company that I was just working with, they're having their quarterly check-ins. Every 2 weeks, managers meet with staff to see how things are going. I interviewed 10 people, 9 out of the 10 glowing reviews. They liked everything. And the one person had some own personal issues. We got those issues. We're going to address them. But all in all, the way they were handling it was positive, and it allows us then to move forward. So those are just some benefits to the employer.
All right, benefits to the employees, it's the flip side of the same coin. The benefits are not one-sided. Both employers and subordinates will all stand to gain by doing regular check-ins, whether it's an annual review. But as Sal points out, we are fervent believers in reviews on a more regular basis than once a year. Employees stand to gain by the implementation of performance reviews in very basic ways, some of which are commonsensical. One is it makes them aware of the specific areas where they need improvement. As Sal points out, if you wait for that once a year, then you're letting bad habits, performance flaws just take root and deepen, and you're doing nobody a favor. From the management side, you're just letting poor performance continue. From the employee side, something that may be fixable, you're just letting it sustain itself for a much longer period of time. We also find it ironic when there's a new employee and there is a probationary period. Typically, it's 90 days, right? So you're going to have that check-in to decide whether or not you keep somebody or cut them loose after 90 days. But once you hire them, we're only going to check in with you once a year, right? But it allows that employee to be put on notice of what the problem is. If you have that check-in, the more likely to feel engaged in their work, the more likely to feel valued by the employer. My supervisor's taking the time to devote the time to me to help me perform better. Just on a human level, that's going to make most people feel better about the place they're working in. They're going to feel more connected to the business operations. It might instill a deeper sense of loyalty. Yes, it's a business relationship. We all get that. But these little nuances do have impact if handled correctly. It tells the employee, what's expected of them. We see that as supervising partners in our law firm, right? If you don't spend that time up front with your employee to give them a roadmap of what's expected, they might be going off into left field in a way that's unhelpful to them, unhelpful to you as a supervisor, and unhelpful to the organization. So having that, interaction tells them this is what's expected of you. This is how we expect you to get it done. Giving them that real-time feedback helps them stay true on their course to good performance. Reminding them of behavioral standards as well, because there's the work, but then there's also how they interact with their colleagues. If something is not, being handled correctly by an employee, let them know right away. Because otherwise, when you're talking about behavioral issues, not just performance issues, you'll have that ripple effect where if someone's behaving poorly, maybe they're aware of it, maybe they're not aware of it. The employee who's affected by their behavior, that might undermine their performance. So by having this interaction sooner than later, you can avoid all of those negative outcomes. An employee who doesn't know what the expectations are, doesn't know that the performance is lagging in any way, may feel undervalued, and again, less likely to meet expectations. Okay, performance reviews in employment litigation. Just before we go into the subject matter here, we just want to stress one thing. As Sal said, there's different buckets that we're talking about here. What's good for the employer, what's good for the employee, and then there's the litigation component. The threshold primary goal of conducting a proper performance review is to improve performance. It's not to say, hey, I might get sued, or the organization might get sued, and therefore I must, as a supervisor, conduct this performance review a certain way because a bunch of guys in suits gave this webinar and that's what they told me, right? It shouldn't work that way. I mean, it's too abstract, right? There might be a lawsuit down the line. The primary focus should be doing a good performance review to improve performance sooner rather than later. That has all the benefits that Sal just walked through and I walked through. But another objective is what happens if there's going to be a litigation. Unsatisfactory performance is one of the most common reasons for, terminations. And for that reason, performance reviews are going to be front and center as the proof that tips the balance in any litigation. To either show that the performance was unsatisfactory, or as Sal gave those examples, all of a sudden he gets the paper. That's the first thing we ask for in an employment litigation. Give us the file, including all disciplinary documentation. So performance reviews become central in many employment discrimination cases and retaliation cases and whistleblower cases, because they are typically the employer's first and sometimes only formal and written communication to the employee about job performance. Those real-time interactions, it might simply be a conversation for a few minutes. We strongly, say that you should document, even in a simple email to file, those little limited interactions. But generally, it's going to be the performance review that's going to be the only documentation about how well that employee did. Even when unsatisfactory performance is the stated reason for the termination, if the reviews, as Sal pointed out, don't reflect that, it's going to blow apart your case. We've had, a lot of cases where the absence of the documentation to substantiate the claim of, oh, he or she was terrible for the last 6 months. I don't know how many times I spoke to her or him about their performance. Okay, where's it written? Because then we'll get those 5 out of 5 or 10 out of 10 check the box kind of things. And it puts you as the employer in one of two untenable positions. Either you're lying about the bad performance because your own documentation refutes that, or you just were too lazy and therefore not a credible witness because you didn't take the time to be honest in your evaluation. Either way, you're coming out of the south side of that equation. Right? So you want to be careful about how you do those reviews because it can undermine, the viability of your defense in a litigation.
Now, moving to something a little bit more specific, performance reviews to establish a pretext.
I just wanted to, and be honest about the documentation. One case that we had, the employee said, I was never told about performance problems. And the supervisor insisted, no, 2 months before she was fired, I gave a performance review and I documented it and even gave us the document, right? And we go, all right, cool, that's great. It's dated 2 months before the termination. And the employee, the former employee, the terminated employee, insisted it was otherwise. It never happened, never happened. Well, guess what? Their lawyer in discovery asked for the metadata to show when the document was created. And guess what? Turns out the supervisor was lying in that document that we said, well, we have a great defense. Hey, finally, someone gave us good documentation. The metadata showed it was created after the termination. So it's not enough to have good documentation. It has to be truthful documentation.
Yeah, that's a good point. And unfortunately, people not being honest gets themselves in more trouble. So performance reviews to establish a pretext. What we mean by that is when Andy and I are defending these cases, if it goes to a demand letter, if it goes to a litigation, we typically will state or write to whether it's the Division of Human Rights, the EEOC, or in a court process that, Joseph was terminated because of poor performance, couldn't meet skills, was late, was tardy, all the, the details and the reasons why the person was terminated. And then what the other side will come back and say, if they have a lawyer or if you're dealing with the Department of Human Rights, division of human rights, excuse me, what they'll come around and say is, well, that's just all after the fact. It's a pretext. It's created or fabricated to cover up the real reason that you terminated Joseph was because of his gender, because of his race, because of something else, or if it's Josephine, and the example is because she was pregnant or something along those lines. Well, the way you combat that is you have to demonstrate as an employer that no, there was a legitimate, non-discriminatory reason why I terminated the person. And oftentimes what we look to see is what's been the history of the person's performance, what do the reviews look like? If you have it documented, and let's say, and we're going to get into some more details about how you draft it and how you put it together, but a lot of times we just have a scale 1 to 5, 1 to 10. If it's that review on a 1 to 10 scale and it's just all 10s, well, that undermines that there were problems with Joseph or Josephine's performance, right? Now, let's say you have it and it's 1 to 10 and they scored 2 in the category, 2 in attendance, 2 in proficiency, 4 in ability to do the job, 5 and works well with others. Now they have nothing that's really close to the 10, nothing that's satisfactory and above. We can rely on that in a litigation to say, dear judge, dear court, dear reviewer, here are the performance reviews. They're on notice. This has been a problem for the last 6 months to a year, and we have it documented in real time. So now when you have that documentation there, it's not conclusory. It's not a summary. It's there and it's in writing. And again, as Andy said, it's got to be in that real time. So the performance reviews, again, just helps on the back end of you demonstrating why you did something maybe months after some of the issues that happened.
And so what we're going to walk through now is just some best practices in conducting these performance reviews. We're telling you, we already told you in a conclusory way that if you do it poorly, it can hurt you in a litigation or even in response to a pre-litigation demand. So what Sal and I are going to walk through now, just how to implement an effective process. And that's going to start with training the evaluators.
So in terms of training the evaluators, I've done a couple of programs lately at some national conferences, and then I've done them for individual clients. And what we do is we come in and do like a train-the-trainer type program, or we call it a management training. And folks can do this on their own. There's many ways to do it. I think we've set up a nice program in terms of putting together. I have slides that we can populate, and we bring up a form of a performance review. And what you want to do is you want to have the evaluators to be objective. You want them to be honest, but we want them working in a cohesive fashion. In other words, and you look at it like, think back to when you were in school, high school, college, grad school, whatever it was. I may be a soft grader. I may think everything's great and I'm just very easy. And 1 out of 5, Andy gets a 5, another 5. Andy may be a stricter grader and he may look at things a little bit differently and put 3s in certain categories. And it's the same person doing the same work, but he thinks it's a 3, I think it's a 5. So how do we get over that? Well, we talk to the evaluators. We ask for some objective criteria. What we want them to do is detail how long does it take a person to complete a task? How many evaluations do they complete? When you talk, maybe it's accounts receivable. How many accounts are they getting to collect in a particular time period? If it's someone with medical records, how many cases are they submitting and closing and submitting for file? If it's a provider or a nurse, how many cases are they seeing per day compared to their peers and their contemporaries? So we want to try to set some objective criteria. And when we go in, we sit with the evaluators, we bring up a mock slide and detail what information we're looking for. And as important as it is to set the objectives and the criteria that you're looking for, you want to train those evaluators on the things not to do. We want to talk about how to talk to someone, how not to talk to someone. In an evaluation, we don't want, and we've had these are real lines, my 9-year-old could do it better. Well, that may be the case. Maybe your 9-year-old can do it, but look, my 9-year-old can do certain things on computers better than I can right now. But you don't want to hear that in a job review, right? So we want to say, you need improvement in this particular area. We think we need some additional skills here. Can we get you more training? And have the evaluator have those kind of buzzwords and phrases ready to go versus you're dumb. You're never going to amount to anything, and these are things that we've had people say in these evaluations. So again, you want your evaluators to know what's going on, what the objective is, and have a company line, a company process in place.
And just so you know, that Sal and I do a fair amount of train the trainer training sessions. And from the beginning of those sessions to the end, you can almost feel a change in certain members of the audience, because like as Sal says, it's not just telling them the words to say and the tone, it's the melody too, how you say it, what inflection in your voice, etc. Training your trainers, and it doesn't take hours upon hours to do, but a lot of people feel if they're going to do an evaluation or performance review, it's just I just have to tell so and so how well they're doing, right? And yeah, it's a conversation, of course, a dialogue, but there's a certain way to do it and there's a way not to do it, and people need to be educated on the proper ways to do these things. One of them is, and going back to the Sal's point of having metrics to rely upon, assess the employee's performance using specific criteria, specific and objective criteria. You want your review to be as objective and specific as possible. You don't have to design a performance review for each employee, but you should consider designing a review in particular for certain job titles and job descriptions, maybe categories of employees, and each review should assess the particular job duties and responsibilities. And Sal gave you some examples, just hypothetical examples that you can use for that particular job title and so on. The review should assess the employee's achievement or lack of achievement of specified targets and goals. And most jobs are going to have certain objective-based metrics. Other aspects of the job that should be covered in the review should be the ability to take instruction, the ability to communicate and work effectively with coworkers, play well in the sandbox sort of thing. Whether the employee just demonstrates initiative or just sits back and waits to be told, I need you to perform a particular task. Their attitude in the workplace, because let's face it, attitude is a pretty critical criteria in having the workplace or operationally have things flow smoothly. The reviewer, we suggest, should be a supervisor or a manager, someone with firsthand knowledge of the employee's work performance and what the job entails, and any other factors considered in the review, such as the employee's strengths and weaknesses, attitudes, goals. Someone who knows what the job is and who the employee is and how those two go together. If you have any concern, and we've had those cases where there's an allegation or suggestion or possibility that the supervisor may be biased in some way, or not someone who is otherwise qualified to conduct the review, you can consider just having some replacement play that role. Maybe a supervisor from another team sitting in who can get educated and informed about the specifics involving that particular employee, but who otherwise knows what the job requires. Again, a different supervisor or manager, or you can have someone from HR as well. The reviewer should assess each aspect of the employee's performance separately, go down through the different criteria. Not allow good or poor performance in one area affect the other. We've seen that too. It's like, oh, you know what, they were terrible, and they got 2s out of 5. You know what, just 2s, right? No, again, you want to be fair, right? You want to give a truthful assessment of the performance of the employee. So, attitude is one thing, performance is another thing, playing well in the sandbox is another thing, etc. Again, be fair and correct as to each one of those. The final draft, should be reviewed by preferably a third party if your workplace allows for something like that, such as an HR representative, to ensure that the wording is correct, that it complies with policies. If you have a collective bargaining agreement, that could be another variable to take into account. You want someone who's going to look at it to make sure that it's fair, that it's consistent across the board. Sometimes we get these reviews where criteria A and B should correlate, but somehow they don't. They're incongruous numbers, and it just doesn't make sense on paper. And if there's a problem, then you send it back to the reviewer to correct that problem. If something's left out, you have the reviewer fill it in. You want that document to be a complete and accurate depiction of the performance of that employee.
And just before we switch gears on this one note, Andy touched on it, I just want to add something to it. If you have the opportunity, go through your performance evaluation itself, see what it looks like to determine how can I craft it for certain roles within my department. And what I mean by that is I've been working a lot with ABA providers and therapy providers. And the number one complaint I hear about staff is they're not closing their notes in a timely fashion. And they're not documenting the records for when they're completed within a timely fashion. If that's something you're experiencing, for example, add that to your evaluation for next year. Have that as a criteria. If you don't have it on there, you don't have the time or bandwidth to add it, have like a category that says other, and leave a space where the reviewer can put in there not closing notes in a timely fashion, not doing this. And the same thing for front desk. The biggest complaint I hear about from front desk staff, why they always want to be fired, is they're late and their attendance is poor. Those are the top two things. If we open at 9, but I expect you there at 8:30, that's when you have to have a category for attendance, punctuality, and what that means so you can elaborate on it instead of just a generic form of, things that don't matter to your business or your practice.
Should be obvious, but trust us, it's apparently not so obvious. Be straightforward and honest. Straightforward and honest reviews give the employees the information they need to improve their performance. Although it's might be easier to avoid discussing an employee's underperformance, if you fail to provide them the constructive criticism that they need, you're doing a disservice to the employee, to the employer as well, because we've had cases where a reviewer may disregard or inflate an employee's performance in a particular aspect. And the end result is the employee doesn't know what's wrong with their performance. They can't fix it. It's only going to get worse, right? You want to give them clear information about what's wrong, a prescription for improvement, and if they're in a particularly bad way, tell them where they stand. We've had too many cases, unfortunately, where someone has gotten fired, and we're called in. Sometimes it's pre-litigation, sometimes litigation, sometimes in real time, where we're called in to handle the particular termination. And the person will say, my supervisor never told me it was that bad. And we'll speak to the supervisor, and he or she will say, well, I told them this is a serious issue that needs correcting. And we'll say, no, did you tell them explicitly, expressly, unequivocally, clearly, Billy Bob, Betty Sue, look, if this doesn't improve, you're going to be disciplined. If this doesn't improve, depending upon the facts, you're going to get fired. We're going to give you 6 months to fix this. If it doesn't get fixed, we're going to have to let you go. You need to be blunt, not to be cruel. It's the opposite. Cruel is not letting somebody know what's wrong and letting them just flail around before they get fired without knowing what it was that led to their termination. So be clear, be unequivocal. It's not about being friendly. It's, why not be collegial? Why not be respectful? Why not be, of course, be professional? But you have to be clear and honest. Don't sugarcoat. It's a fatal mistake.
Details. We keep coming back to talking about being as detailed as possible. That comes from, I think there's two ways to deal with this. One is get that form in good working order, right? Have something that's constructed well, that has some thought into it, that you can follow as a good roadmap and guideline. It'll make the review a lot easier for the people who are doing the review if you can get there. And the second part about it is giving some specifics. And I know that's general, but so what do I mean? Let me explain it a little bit. Someone who's absent or tardy, I see this on performance reviews, Jane is tardy a lot. Okay, what does that mean? In comparison to who? If I'm a lawyer on the other side and I get Jane is tardy a lot or Jane is absent a lot, I don't know what that means. I'll still fight that fight and litigate it. Versus Jane was late 3 times in May on the following dates. Maybe you don't even have to list the dates because you have it recorded somewhere, but 3 times in May. Jane was late 4 times in June. Jane was absent 7 times in July with unexcused absences and failed to contact her supervisor to let her know that she was going to be absent on these 3 of those 7 occurrences. Now we have some detail about what's going on. And as Andy said, then you're going to discuss that with Jane in that context and say, you were late on these occasions. You may find out one of 2 things. There's no excuse. And then Jane is a bad employee and we're going to move on from Jane shortly or at that point in time. You may find out that Jane needs some assistance or that there's some particular problem that maybe can be alleviated with a reasonable accommodation or something else. And in either case, it goes back to what we initially talked about, which is you're going to be better for knowing the answer to that. You can improve the tardiness, or you can cut bait and move on and start with somebody new. So it's those kind of things. I had a case recently where a very high level official in the company just had a very generic approach of, this person who I hired, she can't use Excel. He just kept saying, can't even use Excel. And I've used that example a couple of times because it's fresh in my mind. And just generally can't use Excel. Well, the response we got in the lawsuit was, it addressed that, said she can't use Excel. She's been using it for 20 years, is proficient, has a certification, has training. She could use Excel. She just couldn't use Excel the way we needed it to in our AR function, okay, in our particular model with our particular programs. So when I peel back those layers of that onion with this high-level official, it was more than just couldn't use Excel. There were details, but those details were not in the performance review, and they were not in any email communications. It was just a very broad stroke. Can't do it. You got to provide that detail. You have to provide something. And that's what those columns you should have on the side of your performance reviews. We do in our office, we recommend it. 1 to 10, explain. Other, add something. Use of Excel, 1. And then detail why it's a 1. Put something down. So it's those kind of details that will go a long way. Considering employee feedback, this is always something that concerns employers. Should we ask? Should we not? What do we do? Most common question I get at presentations about employee feedback is, what happens when the employee refuses to sign? So it's acceptable. It's okay to get employee feedback because, as Andy said, he touched on it. I have dozens of cases where the first thing the other attorney tells me or the employee says at a hearing is, no one ever told me. I didn't know that. I never got offered more training. The way I like to do it is present it. Are you doing okay? Is there anything else we could do to help you? Do you need more training? No, we don't, Mr. Puccio. No, I'm good. The manager tells me, great, write it down. Employee said no to more training. Employee said they understand the role of their job. And then fast forward, if they're still not doing it, we've offered it, we've tried. On the flip side, again, the goal here is to get people being productive and efficient. If they tell you, well, I don't really understand that program, I'm not really sure how to do this, I could use a little bit more work on that machine, this new equipment, get that. Put those resources in place. The person is going to either sink or swim, right? They're going to do a great job, and now you've solved the problem, or we find out they can't, you move on. So put it back on the employee. I'm comfortable with that. And in terms of if the employee refuses to sign, that's fine. They don't have to sign. There's no mandate that they sign. Just note, employee refused to sign. Put a note there. That way, when we disclose it later, we can say we handed it to the employee and they refused to sign it, so that there's no question if they received it or not.
Before I go on there's someone wrote in our organization, we conduct both a manager assessment and an employee self-assessment, followed by a discussion that leads to the final review. As the HR rep, I serve as a neutral third party in that conversation to help ensure fairness and alignment. Is this approach advisable in terms of promoting objectivity, trust, and meaningful development outcomes? I guess the first thing I'll say is it depends on the organization and whether or not you have the HR personnel who can invest that kind of time. If you can, it can be helpful. One thought, a spontaneous thought, is about compressing that dialogue. It sounds like you have a manager self-assessment, employee self-assessment, and then that discussion where the employee is sitting in the room with the manager, where they're each exchanging their reviews, as opposed to, as Sal pointed out, the manager is asking in real time during the review the employee. So I shared with you as a manager how I thought you were doing. How do you think you did this year, right? What do you think we could do to help you perform better? And then just doing it in one fell swoop. If you're going to break it up if you're going to have a third party sitting in the room with the manager and the employee sharing their reviews, or the review and the self-assessment, there's a part of me that feels that can be, prone to giving the misimpression that they're both on the same level, that the employees, self-assessment sits on the same level as the managers. That can create, I think, a certain misperception of the reality of the hierarchy and create certain tension lines. As opposed to doing it after the fact, where if you have that conversation as Sal framed it out, where you're asking as the manager, the reviewer, what do you think how well do you think you did? And if there's a disconnect where the employee goes, I thought I did great. I think I deserve nines. You gave me fives. That's what that conversation is about, right? If there is some underlying problem where you have some bias or just a poorly trained reviewer, then you can fix it, on an organizational or management level. But I'm not so certain having three people in the room discussing their various views is necessarily ideal. But again, if it's working for you, keep doing it. Don't fix what's not broken.
Yeah, just to add to that, Andy, I think we're going to touch on it later on, but it's good to bring it up here. Employee either self-assessments or employee, comments on what they think and what they could use, more improvement, how the organization can do better. I think they certainly can be helpful. You have to be careful of two things. One, Andy touched on, which is, are you going to pin the employee and the manager against each other? I'd be doing better if my manager knew how to manage, that kind of thing. And we see that a lot. But so if you're going to be that third party intermediary in HR, that should come to you. It shouldn't go to the manager, because I was just having one recently where the manager felt like he was getting attacked by what the staff were saying, and now the manager's on defense the whole time and they can't do their job. So you got to ferret that out. The other thing that you have to keep in mind, if you're going to go that route with the self-assessments, more often than not, the self-assessments are going to be, I'm the best employee ever, I'm the greatest thing since sliced bread, I am expecting my promotion type thing. That's fine, but you have to be prepared to equally knock that down if it's appropriate. Now, if the person is the greatest thing and they're ready to get promoted, that's fine. That's the good kind of, situation we want. If, however, this person is missing big gaps and doesn't understand that he or she is not clicking on all cylinders, you have to be prepared in real time to write back and say, these are the shortcomings, and go back to everything we talked about, the details. Okay, you can't just say you're not good. You've got to detail it. So it's great. You just have to do some additional work.
And that self-assessment is, as we have used the phrase on more than one occasion when someone's getting terminated. It's we've never heard a situation where someone gets terminated and goes, you know what, you're right, I'm terrible. I'm one of the worst performers I've ever seen in my life. If I was you, I'd fire me too. No, it's usually, I was doing a fine job. I wasn't told I wasn't doing a fine job. Same thing during the performance reviews. They're missing gaps they have gaps in their knowledge about what's required, maybe what the comparators are to their fellow employees. So there's limitations to the self-assessment that you really need to take into account. Avoid emotional, sarcastic, or superfluous language. Reviews can be pretty stressful, pretty emotional, both for the reviewer and the employee whose compensation, job status, promotion, is dependent upon, how well that review plays out. So to the extent possible, reviewers should avoid overly emotional comments, keep the discussion professional. Some reviewers mistakenly resort to sarcasm or humor when discussing the review, especially when addressing, the unpleasant, or taking on the unpleasant task of saying where someone is underperforming, right? Don't do it. Be professional again, be blunt, be honest, and so on. Avoid sarcasm, avoid jokes. They're typically going to fall flat, or worse, they're going to show up, whatever language, you're going to use in a litigation to just point out how unprofessional the organization was and how unprofessional the supervisor was. And here it is in this important moment of my professional life, he or she is joking and using sarcasm and et cetera and so on. Keep the language professional, okay? And it goes back to training the trainers. As the reviewer, you should be prepared as to what you're going to say and how you're going to say it before you walk in that room. Don't wing it. Don't be spontaneous, because you're not necessarily going to be able to control the conversational flow depending upon how emotional the employee is, okay? So be prepared walking in, and that'll help you avoid some of the pitfalls associated with emotional, sarcastic, or ad-lib language.
Conduct a timely performance review. We've stressed it and talked about it. We're going to skip through this one quickly. Have it set, have expectations of when it's happening, so people just know, your staff can expect what's going to happen, so your managers can help do the evaluation. Again, if it can be throughout the year, multiple times, one or two times, that's great. Quarterly check-ins are great. Along those lines, if you see someone who does, we're talking all about the negative, right? That's kind of where we operate from as your counsel in terms of making sure we're preventing, or how do we address the worst situations. But you're going to have plenty of employees who are doing a good job. And from a morale perspective, it's okay to go around, even if it's not your formal review season, to go give so-and-so a pat on the back and say, hey, that was a nice job you did with so-and-so. You really handled that patient situation really well. I know we were busy today. Thanks a lot. So it's okay to give those real-time reviews as well that are positive. And likewise, in your review at the end of the year, that kind of positive touch. As we're concluding, avoid some common pitfalls. We've touched on a couple of these.
Relevant to what Sal just said, someone wrote, if I have a sit-down conversation with an employee to provide feedback and make a correction, but it isn't a formal review, does putting a note in the employee file detailing the conversation suffice and qualify as, quote, documentation? Or do I need to give the employee the opportunity to review the note and sign it? The answer is you don't have to give them the opportunity to review and sign it. That simple email to files, spoke with Zwerling about need to improve in X, Y, and Z. He said he would take care of it. That's great. That's all you need. It doesn't have to, you don't have to write, much more than that. Something simple like that. If we get a litigation or pre-litigation demand, that gives us these placeholder comments. So simple is fine. That's an excellent approach.
Yeah, that's a great comment and question. I think that's done appropriately.
Yeah.
So just some of the common pitfalls, and we're both going to talk on this one a little bit, but some for me are, one thing that was told to me early on as we started to review people and you start talking about it is there's the sandwich method, that a lot of people use, right? It's a good approach. And what that is, you start with the positive, you factor in some of the areas that need improvement, and then you try to conclude with the positive. We really like you, Bill. You're doing a great job. We want to see you improve. You're working well with others. End it on that high note. And everyone's going to have their own style and how they do this. And be honest about your style and explain it. I think if you're just transparent in who you are and where the evaluation is coming from, that's going to come across a lot better. For me, for example, I'm highly critical of things, not because I want to put somebody down, but because I want to see them improve. And what I say to people is, and it's the same approach I take when I coach my kids in Little League and in sports, I'm not being hard on you because I want to be mean and that type of coach or that type of parent. It's because I see the positive in you and I want to lift you up. So the reason I'm helping you and talking to you about this is because I want to see you improve. That makes us better as a group, as an organization, and that's going to make our patients safer. That's going to make our customers happier. And if you come across with that personality and explain that that's why you're doing it, they're not going to look at you as just that pain in the neck who's always coming down on them. And you know what? If they do, you don't want to be associated with them. That's not the right place for them. It's not the right place for you to be working with them. So just have that open dialogue, hit those points. And the last thing I'll say is don't guess or speculate when you're in a review. Like Andy said, be prepared. If someone says to you, well, I did this, and this, don't make up the amount of times they were late. You got to know because you could be recorded, it could be documented later. So just keep that in mind.
And just one point to piggyback what Sal said before about how you cast the review. And it's not just blowing smoke at people. If you handle it one way, the person's going to walk away saying, wow, my boss just tore me down. As opposed to if you handle it another way and use it as a teaching moment. Those aren't just hokey words. It's a real approach on a human level. If you're sitting down with someone and saying, hey, look, I want to work with you for the next 50 years. I want you to have my job. That's what I'm training you to do. I'm training you to move up. So let's use this as a teaching moment. You didn't do this correctly. I understand why you made that mistake. It's for on the timeline of, like your job experience, it makes sense. A lot of people make that same mistake. Here's how you can fix it, right? How you cast that review, all right? And again, you still want to be blunt. If someone's scoring a 1 out of 10 and 10 being the best, you need to hit them between the eyes with it. But even in that situation, your job, your objective shouldn't be to have that person walking out thinking like, I'm awful. I better start looking for another job. I mean, if you want them to look for another job, you should tell them that, okay? That goes to being blunt and straightforward, okay? But if your mission is to make them a better employee and help them out in that respect, then even the person scoring a 1 You want them to walk out saying, all right, that was awful, my rating. But you know what? My boss has my back and my boss is going to try and help me improve and show me that roadmap to improvement. So, that's a critical overlay to everything Sal and I said today.
Yeah, that's it. So if there's any other questions, we'll hang here for a minute or follow up with Andy or myself. I think here's our contact information. You can, reach us directly. You can also get us through the website and find us. I think we'll probably have a link to this. We can put it up for you folks to watch again. And we look forward to being with you again in our next part of our series and answering any questions or helping you through anything we can.
Someone asked, how do I register for one of your management courses? Just reach out to us and we can explain that information. We usually, do it on a client by client basis. Small places, small workplaces to large institutions. So we do our best to tailor it to the situation. So reach out and we'll have a conversation to see what it is you need and how, we can best accommodate you.
Yeah, and they're usually, depending on the size or the scale of what's needed, we let the clients dictate that an hour to 2 hours. And a lot of what I do is if I take it from HR where HR is telling me, our staff are not doing this, they're not reporting to HR, that's how we tailor it so we can get some guidance from you, not a stock type training situation.
Exactly. All right.
All
Thanks,
right,
everybody.
Thank you so much. Have a great day.
You well.